For generations, aviation fanatics have argued over one question. Out of every piston engine fighter that actually flew in combat during World War II, which one was the fastest? Between boiling hot engines, razor-thin air at high altitude, and wings pushed to their aerodynamic limits, the race for speed turned into an engineering war all its own. Nations poured resources into squeezing out every last mile per hour, knowing that a few seconds could mean the difference between burning aircraft or returning home alive. Today, using confirmed wartime test data and verified performance records, we're counting down the 8 fastest propeller fighters that really flew. Not prototypes, not paper concepts. And before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into forgotten history and legendary aircraft. Now, let's go from number 8 to the undisputed king of speed in 1945. At number 8 sits Germany's late-war answer to Allied high-altitude pressure, the Focke-Wulf Fw 190D9, better known among pilots simply as the Dora. Up close, the difference from earlier variants was unmistakable. The short, chunky radial nose of the original Fw 190A was gone, replaced by a long, sleek engine compartment housing the liquid-cooled Junkers-Jumo power plant. This extension gave the Dora a needle-like profile, elegant yet intimidating, and it represented more than a cosmetic change. It was Germany's attempt to squeeze extra altitude and horsepower from a platform already proven lethal since 1941. During the first half of the war, Fw 190s terrorized Allied pilots at lower altitudes. Their roll rates were astonishing, their dive performance superb, and their armament devastating. But as the conflict dragged on and Allied bombers climbed higher, the original radials struggled to breathe. American B-17 and B-24s cruised above flak bursts, escorted by Mustangs with monstrous range. Something had to change, so German engineers stretched the airframe, swapped the engine, and reinforced structures to counter new torque loads. The result was a machine that could finally meet bombers where they hid. Production ramped up in the summer of 1944, just as Germany's skies grew darker with Allied formations. Over 700 D9s rolled off assembly lines before the final surrender. They were thrown into battle immediately, sometimes piloted by veterans with thousands of hours, sometimes by rookies who had barely mastered takeoff. Pilots praised the Dora's ability to climb more aggressively, accelerate faster, and survive punishment long enough to disengage when odds turned ugly. Its redesigned tail improved stability at altitude, and in the right hands, it could scare even late-war Allied fighters. But time was Germany's greatest enemy. Fuel shortages crippled training programs. Skilled aces died faster than replacements could graduate. Radar-guided Allied fighters mauled formations before Fw 190s could even assemble. The Dora fought with courage, but desperation weighed heavily on every sortie. Its long, pointed nose became a symbol of last-chance innovation, and the brutal reality that engineering miracles don't win wars without supply, pilots, or fuel. Even so, the Dora earned respect from those who faced it. In smoky skies over ruined cities, it clawed for altitude, dove into bomber streams, and rolled away from danger with signature ferocity. A final, determined snap of Germany's once dominant air power. Sliding into the 7th position is Britain's muscular and deceptively streamlined Hawker Tempest Mk.V, capable of reaching an impressive 135 miles per hour. To understand why this aircraft mattered, you have to look backward, because its origins come from frustration. The Tempest was born from the bones of the troubled Hawker Typhoon, a fighter with immense raw power but design flaws that made it unreliable at high speed and altitude. Engineers refused to abandon the project. Instead, they redesigned the wing structure, slimmed the cross-section, and optimized airflow around the engine. What emerged was something the Royal Air Force never expected: a piston fighter with ruthless performance at low levels and enough speed to chase down threats most aircraft could barely see. Timing could not have been more dramatic. In the spring of 1944, Germany unleashed a new terror across the English coastline: pilotless V-1 flying bombs. These weapons roared across the Channel at blistering speeds, detonating with enormous force against civilian neighborhoods. Traditional fighters struggled to intercept them. The Tempest, however, could run them down in level flight. British pilots quickly discovered they didn't even need to fire their guns. By edging their wingtip beneath the V-1's stubby wing and rolling gently, they could flip it from the sky without igniting the explosive payload over friendly towns. Within weeks, Tempest squadrons racked up staggering interception totals. Their modified wing design allowed tight rolls and sharp dives at low altitude, giving pilots a brutal advantage when dogfights dropped below the cloud layer. Unit logs from the summer and fall of 1944 read like hunting tallies, each pilot scribbling accounts of missiles destroyed, fighters scattered, and ground attacks executed with grim efficiency. But the Tempest wasn't just a defensive miracle. When used offensively, its combination of speed, endurance, and 4 short-barreled cannons turned it into a nightmare for German aircraft retreating toward dwindling fuel depots. Luftwaffe pilots learned quickly: you never wanted to be caught at treetop height, with a Tempest behind you. As Allied armies stormed deeper into occupied Europe, Tempest wings followed closely overhead. They pounced on locomotives, strafed convoys, and shredded supply chains already buckling under pressure. Even late-war German jets respected the Tempest's acceleration. At the right altitude and angle, no piston aircraft closed distance faster. Veterans of the Royal Air Force would later say the Tempest felt less like flying an aircraft and more like being strapped to controlled violence. Raw horsepower wrapped in aerodynamic discipline. And in the war's final year, that was exactly what Britain needed. Claiming the 6th spot is Britain's sleek and brutally upgraded Supermarine Spitfire Mk.XIV, a machine that could tear through the sky at an astonishing 446 miles per hour. On paper, it's simply another Spitfire. In reality, it's a completely different animal. By 1943, the iconic Spitfire design was showing its limits against Germany's newest aircraft. Engineers needed a leap forward, not a tweak. The answer arrived in the form of the Rolls-Royce Griffon engine, an enormous power plant delivering more than twice the horsepower of the early Merlin-powered Spitfires that survived the Battle of Britain. When the Griffon was first mounted to the Spitfire's delicate frame, test pilots immediately discovered the issue. Raw power twisted the airframe like a living thing. To solve this, designers enlarged the vertical tail, strengthened internal supports, and updated the propeller system to tame the monstrous torque. Once perfected, the transformation was astonishing. The Mk.XIV accelerated like something alive, climbing through the clouds with shocking authority. Pilots described it as gripping a rocket that happened to have wings. The timing of its arrival couldn't have been more crucial. High-altitude German reconnaissance aircraft swept across Britain, snapping photographs with impunity. Older fighters struggled to catch them. But when the Mk.XIV entered squadron service in early 1944, the balance flipped overnight. Those reconnaissance pilots, once untouchable, suddenly found a shadow on their tail that closed distance faster than anything they'd seen before. Even more dramatic was its performance against Germany's new jet fighters. Although jets possessed superior raw speed, they bled velocity in turns, and the Mk.XIV's blistering acceleration allowed pilots to pounce during those weaknesses. Engagement reports from 1944 and 1945 described German jet pilots diving for home, only to watch the Griffin-powered Spitfire lurking closer than expected, its 4 powerful cannons ready to strike. Despite its speed and lethal firepower, the Mk.XIV retained the balanced handling characteristics that made the Spitfire legendary. Pilots praised its responsiveness, its visibility, and its ability to recover from aggressive maneuvers without losing control. More than 900 were produced before the war ended, and each represented the evolution of a design Britain refused to let fade. The Mk.XIV was more than a fast upgrade. It was proof that even late in the conflict, piston engine innovation still had somewhere to go. Against overwhelming odds, the Spitfire reinvented itself one final time and ensured Germany never owned the skies again. In 5th place sits an American fighter many people forget existed because it arrived mere months before the fighting stopped. The Grumman F8F Bearcat wasn't designed to be pretty. It wasn't built for long-range escort missions. It wasn't meant to carry massive bombs. It had one singular purpose: to be the fastest, quickest climbing, most responsive piston fighter ever to launch from a carrier deck. And to do that, engineers did something bold. They wrapped an enormous Pratt & Whitney power plant around the smallest possible airframe that could survive its output. From the moment test pilots pushed the throttle forward, they realized the Bearcat wasn't a gentle machine. It rocketed upward with violent acceleration, reaching 10,000 feet in under 95 seconds, faster than anything America had flown up to that point. Its roll rate bordered on ridiculous, allowing pilots to snap the aircraft sideways faster than the human brain could fully process. What made it terrifying was how agile it remained at speed. Many fighters stiffened and fought back as velocity increased, but the Bearcat begged for more. Armament was straightforward, but brutal. Most variants carried 4 deadly 20mm cannons. Others housed 6 heavy 50-caliber machine guns, giving pilots enough firepower to shred enemy aircraft or tear holes in destroyer-sized targets. Carrier squadrons loved the plane immediately because it treated short runways like sprint tracks. It could leap into the air with power to spare, a vital trait when operating from small jeep carriers stationed deep in the Pacific. And yet, timing was everything. When the Bearcat finally reached operational units in February of 1945, the war had already shifted. Japan's aerial resistance was collapsing. Only 24 Bearcats reached combat squadrons before Emperor Hirohito surrendered. Pilots begged to deploy them in action, but history moved faster than the aircraft ever could. The greatest performer arrived just a little too late. In the brief months that followed, however, the Bearcat became a legend among those who flew it. In the post-war era, it joined the newly formed Blue Angels, dazzling crowds with its impossible maneuverability. It smashed time-to-climb records that stood for decades, proving that piston engine technology still had hidden edges even as jet engines roared onto the stage. Had this fighter rolled off assembly lines 2 years earlier, Allied pilots would have ruled the sky with terrifying authority. Instead, the Bearcat became something else entirely. A glimpse of what the pinnacle of piston-powered engineering looked like right before the world evolved past it. Taking 4th place is one of the strangest, rarest, and most misunderstood fighters ever to stalk the skies. The Focke-Wulf Ta 152H model, Germany's last-ditch attempt to claw back control of its airspace in 1945. Let's be clear, this wasn't just another variant of the FW190. It was a complete redesign built for one mission: intercept Allied bombers flying so high that most German fighters wheezed for oxygen. To survive combat above 40,000 feet, engineers stretched the wings to nearly 48 feet across, installed a pressurized cockpit, and bolted in a highly refined Junkers Jumo inline engine with a two-stage supercharger that gulped air like a mechanical lung. Suddenly, altitude no longer protected Allied pilots. The Ta 152 soared above 35,000 feet with room to spare, then accelerated and climbed at a rate that stunned anyone fortunate or unfortunate enough to witness it. Allied pilots described encounters where German fighters dove past, then clawed back altitude like they were being dragged upward by invisible cables. At those heights, engines lost power, guns froze, and men struggled to breathe. But the Ta 152 thrived. Its long wings provided the lift others lacked, and its cutting-edge aerodynamics allowed it to maneuver where most fighters became sluggish bricks. Production, however, was a disaster. Germany's industrial network was collapsing under relentless bombing. Factories lost workers. Supplies vanished. Trains were destroyed before reaching assembly lines. Only around 150 of these exotic interceptors were completed, and only a fraction ever reached frontline squadrons. Still, the few that fought left a legacy. In April 1945, a Ta 152 engaged 4 American Mustang fighters at high altitude. Against all odds, the German pilot shot down 2, damaged a 3rd, and escaped into the clouds. An outcome almost impossible for any other fighter that late in the war. Its presence terrified Allied intelligence officers. They studied wreckage and performance reports, realizing how close Germany came to fielding a true high-altitude nightmare. But it was too little, too late. Without fuel, without trained pilots, and with Allied jets arriving daily, even brilliance couldn't reverse the inevitable. The Ta 152 wasn't just a fighter, it was a symbol. It represented a nation so desperate that it reached deep into experimental engineering, clawing for one last edge. And while it arrived months before the surrender, its performance hinted at a frightening truth. Had this machine appeared in 1943, history would have been far messier. Its engines have long gone silent, but its legend remains, a razor-thin glimpse into a future Germany never had the chance to grasp. Landing in the number 3 position is a fighter many historians underestimate, the Republic IP-47M Thunderbolt. To most pilots, the Thunderbolt was already a flying tank. Massive, rugged, and armed with 8 heavy 50-caliber machine guns capable of turning armored gun positions into shredded metal. But by late 1944, Germany introduced a chilling threat. High-altitude reconnaissance planes and early jets darting above 30,000 feet, snapping photos and escaping before Allied fighters could react. The U.S. needed something faster, and they needed it yesterday. Enter the P-47M engineers took an already potent platform and pushed it further than ever intended. They installed a highly tuned Pratt & Whitney power plant paired with an advanced turbocharger system. They lightened internal components, shaved away excess weight, and added water injection systems that unleashed emergency bursts of raw horsepower. The aircraft's acceleration stunned pilots familiar with earlier models. Suddenly, climbing into thin air no longer meant sluggish performance. The P-47M practically clawed up the sky. Only one fighter group ever fielded this exotic beast, the 56th. They reported initial engine trouble so severe that early missions were grounded entirely. Mechanics tore through systems, rewired controls, and fine-tuned every bolt until the motor finally behaved. When it did, the P-47M became a nightmare for German interceptors. Luftwaffe pilots accustomed to outrunning Allied fighters suddenly found a Thunderbolt closing the gap. guns flashing bright against the cold winter sky. Despite its hulking mass, the M model handled with surprising finesse at high speeds. Pilots pushed it through dives that would rip the wings off a lesser craft. In firefights, it absorbed damage that would doom sleeker designs, then roared home-trailing smoke, landing safely again and again. The 56th Fighter Group racked up kills in the final months of the war, harassing retreating aircraft and swatting down Germany's desperate final gambles. Yet production was limited. Just 130 units rolled out. Had the conflict dragged into 1946, this variant would have become a primary weapon against jet-powered intruders. Instead, it became something rarer. A glimpse of the absolute upper limit of piston engine combat power. In a sky full of contenders, the P-47M proved speed didn't need elegance, only engineering aggression and iron-willed pilots. Sliding into the number 2 position is one of the strangest, most experimental fighters ever to reach operational status. The Dornier Do 335, known to Allied intelligence as the Arrow. While nearly every fighter in the war mounted its engines on the wings or nose, Germany gambled on a revolutionary concept, a push-pull configuration. One Daimler-Benz power plant sat in the nose, spinning a tractor propeller. A second engine sat behind the pilot, driving a large pusher propeller at the tail. No bulky wing nacelles, no drag-heavy engine pods, just pure thrust in a streamlined fuselage. At full power, the Do 335 rocketed forward with unmatched straight-line speed. German engineers boasted that it could outrun nearly anything flying, and test reports after capture proved they were right. Allied pilots described acceleration that felt jet-like. In dives, the Arrow became terrifying, rapidly closing distance on fleeing opponents while maintaining enough control to fire accurately. But the brilliance came with complications. 2 engines meant twice the maintenance and twice the complexity. Cooling systems were delicate, production lines were bombed, skilled workers were scarce. Germany's fractured industry simply couldn't birth this mechanical monster fast enough. The cockpit layout, however, impressed everyone. Ejection seats, emergency jettison mechanisms, armored protection. This was a pilot's fighter. Even more impressive, if the rear propeller failed, the aircraft could still limp home on the forward engine alone. Something unheard of on twin-engine fighters. Despite glowing praise from those lucky enough to fly it, the world barely witnessed the Do 335. By the time the first models reached evaluation squadrons in 1945, Allied armies were smashing through the Rhine. Only 37 aircraft were fully completed. None fired in anger. Allied test pilots flew captured examples after the war and left stunned. They called it smooth, stable, and ferociously fast. The piston engine pinnacle that almost arrived too late to matter. The Do 335 stands as a haunting symbol of late-war German innovation. Brilliant, but starving. Ahead of its time, lethal on paper and sabotaged by reality. Claiming the #1 spot is the North American P-51H Mustang, the fastest propeller-driven fighter ever to reach operational status during World War II. At first glance, it looked like the familiar Mustang pilots adored, but every inch was re-engineered to chase one goal: pure speed. Designers trimmed nearly 1,500 pounds from the airframe. They wrapped the fuselage in new aerodynamics, strengthened internal bracing, and removed anything that wasn't absolute necessity. Then they bolted in the Packard-built Merlin engine, pushing out more horsepower than any previous production Mustang variant, boosted further by water injection for emergency power bursts. The result was shocking. In level flight, the P-51H nearly touched 487 miles per hour. a figure other Piston fighters could only dream of. It didn't just climb fast, it launched skyward. Pilots praised its nimble handling, lightning-quick roll rate, and acceleration that made enemy fighters feel frozen in place. Best of all, it retained the Mustang's legendary range, meaning it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory while still outrunning almost anything foolish enough to intercept it. But fate intervened. Production reached full swing in early 1945, only months before Japan surrendered. Some P-51H squadrons reached the Pacific Theater, but none recorded air-to-air engagements before the fighting ended. On paper, it should have ruled the final months of the war. In reality, the world shifted to jets before it ever tasted true combat. After the war, test pilots continued to praise it. If there was a moment when piston engines reached their final evolutionary limit, this was it, standing at the cliff's edge, looking out over the dawn of the jet age. The P-51H wasn't just fast, it was the goodbye letter of propeller technology, signed at nearly 500 miles per hour.